Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Everglades Foundation for this Everglades Restoration 101 session. My name is Begoña Casales, and I am the Director of Communications at the Everglades Foundation, and I think every Floridian should take an Everglades Restoration 101 class. Not only because it is the largest ecosystem restoration project ever done, and so all eyes are on us, but also because restoring the Everglades freshwater flow impacts each and every one of us. The Everglades supplies our drinking water right here in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Monroe counties. It is the fresh water supply for 9 million people, plus all of the tourists that come visit us. So Everglades restoration impacts our capacity for growth. It also impacts Florida's most important industries of tourism, fishing, recreation, and real estate. So pat yourself on the back for joining today, all 269 of you who registered. It was a great turnout. Today's webinar was done in partnership with the University of Miami, and it is the kickoff event for the celebration of the 75th anniversary of Marjory Stoneman Douglas' iconic book, The Everglades River of Grass. A book that was critical in bringing attention to the degradation of the Everglades ecosystem back in 1947, when it was written by this influential University of Miami alumni. On that same year, Everglades National Park was created. So 2022 is also Everglades National Park's 75th anniversary. So stay tuned for lots of activities to learn and celebrate this unique ecosystem that we are so lucky to have in our backyard. So make sure to follow us on social media so you can see what's coming up. So thank you to the University of Miami's Office of Civic and Community Engagement for gathering so many partners in this celebration, including us, the Everglades Foundation. The Everglades Foundation has been working to restore and protect America's Everglades for close to 30 years through science, advocacy, and education. Our team of scientists is led by our Chief Science Officer, Dr. Steve Davis, who will be leading tonight's presentation. Dr. Davis is a native of Ohio. He earned a PhD from Florida International University in 1999 with research in Florida Bay and the coastal Everglades. He draws upon his 25 years of Everglades science and teaching experience, including 10 years as professor of wetland ecology at Texas A&M University. He joined the Everglades Foundation in 2009, where he quickly became a key voice in Everglades restoration. Before I pass it over to him, I want to invite you all to engage in the chat box with comments and questions. I will be keeping an eye and picking some questions so Dr. Davis can answer them at the end. So without further ado, here's Dr. Steve Davis with Everglades Restoration 101.
Well, thank you, Begoña, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll jump right in. And for those of you that are familiar with Everglades restoration, you might understand the scale of this ecosystem. It really spans 100 miles from the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee all the way to the south, but historically its watershed went another 100 miles north all the way up to Orlando, roughly where Disney is. So when we talk about restoring America's Everglades, it's really more than just Everglades National Park, and it's important to keep that in mind. And we'll talk about the economic significance of this as well as the environmental significance. And so many of you understand the different environments that we find across the Everglades. And when Marjory Stoneman Douglas in her book said that there are no other Everglades in the world, she was really right, because we're at the southern tip of this peninsula that extends down into the subtropics. And so we have species and habitats here that you only find in tropical areas. We also have this unique mix of subtropical things that are endemic to the Everglades. And at the same time, we have habitats pictured here in the upper left and upper center, bald cypress trees that you find as far north as Illinois and Ohio. So there's a really interesting mix of habitats that we have down here. And the thing that they all have in common is that they're connected by what was historically a flow of very gradually flowing sheet flow of fresh water all the way south to the tip of the peninsula. And so all these ecosystems are connected by that flow of clean, fresh water. And it's this mix of habitats that really gives rise to the unique faunal assemblage that we find across the Everglades. If we could go back in time, and we had a satellite back in the late 1800s, South Florida would look like this image on the left. It would be that very broad, wide, flowing river of grass all the way from the southern tip of Lake Okeechobee, that 720 square mile freshwater lake in the center of the state. And during the wet season, and many of you know, we get upwards of 4 to 5 feet of rainfall each year, much of that during our wet season or the hurricane season, that lake would fill up and it would spill over to the south. And that water would flow very slowly as a shallow sheet, that 100-mile distance all the way to the tip of the peninsula where the River of Grass meets Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. And so that estuary marked the finish line for that fresh water that was moving through this ecosystem. One of the things to point out about this image on the left is that Atlantic coastal ridge, that narrow rock ridge that extends all the way up to about Jupiter Island, Palm Beach, that area. This is the high ground in South Florida that we first developed. But of course, with growth in our population, certainly with the demand for year-round agriculture, beginning in the early 1900s and through the 1940s, efforts to drain the Everglades were focused on available land for development and available land for agriculture. And it was those muck soils, those organic peat soils south of Lake Okeechobee that were highly desirable for agriculture. And that was really the initial efforts to disconnect Lake Okeechobee with the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike, the canals that were dug to drain water away from the Everglades that led to the Everglades that we have today. And it was really the Central and Southern Florida project, an Army Corps of Engineers authorized project around the same time that Marjorie wrote her book, that really cemented the ecosystem that we have today, that created the water conservation areas, that established this Everglades agricultural area, and allowed for the development of South Florida. So in some ways, it was good to sort of facilitate the growth of South Florida into what we have today. But what we're learning is that those decisions that were made in the 1920s through the 1940s in the name of supporting the economy of the 21st century, those decisions are undermining the 21st century economy of Florida, which we all know is based on tourism, it's based on clean water, and certainly a healthy environment. So that infrastructure changed fundamentally the flow of water. It no longer was connected from Orlando through the chain of lakes, down the Kissimmee River, through Lake Okeechobee and all the way to the south. Now, when water hits Lake Okeechobee, that water is dumped to the east and the west, and these massive volumes of water to those estuaries. Because of the changes around the lake, and the pollution that came about as a result of that proliferation of agriculture, the lake itself became an impaired water body, polluted largely with phosphorus runoff from fertilizers and large cattle grazing and dairy operations. So the lake today is polluted. That water that's dumped east and west carries a load of pollution and oftentimes blue-green algae that is toxic. So that those areas along the east and west coast of Florida are exposed to this pollution and toxins from that blue-green algae. That pollution in the water also, we're learning, exacerbates red tide that forms off the west coast of Florida as those events move closer inshore. So we're seeing the impacts of this water management system, again, that was designed back in the 1940s. To the south, because we're not getting enough fresh water, we see impacts in Florida Bay. Lack of freshwater flow leads to extreme high salinity in this system, and that fuels seagrass die-offs and algae blooms at that end of the system. And then in between, as Begonia mentioned earlier, we depend on this ecosystem for our water supply. So we see water shortages associated with a lack of that fresh water flowing south, particularly in dry years. We also see increased fire frequency and severity across this ecosystem simply because it's too dry for too long. The thing to note is that all of these problems are connected to the same infrastructure, and that's the way we replumb South Florida. The good news is we have a solution in the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. Many of the projects in this plan have yet to be constructed. Some of them are authorized by Congress and are moving forward. The critical piece to this puzzle is the Everglades Reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. This area in the Everglades agricultural area was set aside for construction of a reservoir and a companion marsh to treat the pollution, to clean the water coming out of the lake so that we're sending clean water south to the Everglades. This project might seem small on this map, but it's about 17,000 acres in total area. You could fit the island of Manhattan in this project footprint. So the thing to take away is that these are massive projects. They obviously require large sums of money to construct, but we know they're essential in order to restore Everglades. This is an image from some of the blasting done on the intake canal for this project that's currently underway. The way this project works is like a rain barrel. If you have a rain barrel at your home, it's connected to your downspout, and that rain barrel fills up when it rains, obviously. And that's kind of how this project works. Instead of sending that polluted lake water east and west, we can fill up that rain barrel. With the stormwater treatment area, the marsh that we have to clean up that water, and the other 70,000+ acres of treatment marshes south of Lake Okeechobee, we ensure then that clean water is flowing south to Everglades National Park, ultimately to Florida Bay. The thing to take away is that this project can't do it all, but it does take the biggest bite of the apple in terms of reducing those polluted discharges to the east and west coast. In fact, we see that this project delivers a 55% reduction in those polluted discharges and sends an additional 120 billion gallons of clean fresh water to the south, back to the Everglades annually. That's why this project has been the most important project for the Everglades Foundation since it was first authorized by Congress in 2000 as part of the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. Those of you in South Florida and Miami, especially, if you get out west on Tamiami Trail, you know that the bridges of Tamiami Trail have been built. That's what allows for the conveyance capacity, the plumbing, to get that water ultimately into Everglades National Park, into Shark River Slough, and ultimately down to the Gulf of Mexico and Florida Bay. These projects are in place. We have 3.3 miles of bridging, and if you've been out there recently, you've seen additional road work. They're currently raising the roadbed in between these bridges to allow for restoration capacity flows into the park. That project will be done in July of 2024 and will be ready for those new flows coming from the reservoir when it's built. As I mentioned, and certainly the Everglades Reservoir south of the lake exemplifies this, but these are water infrastructure projects and they're massive in scale. I mentioned you could fit the island of Manhattan in the Everglades Reservoir and stormwater treatment area footprint. This image on the upper left, this is a C43 reservoir that's being constructed along the Caloosahatchee River. This project is of a scale that you can fit O'Hare International Airport, Chicago's airport, as well as Miami International Airport in this footprint. So again, another large storage reservoir that will help to restore the quantity and quality and timing of flows into the Caloosahatchee estuary. The upper middle image is the C-44 reservoir. That project was just completed. They had the ribbon cutting late last year. That project is now operational, improving the quality and quantity of flows going into the St. Lucie estuary, lower Indian River Lagoon. You see one of the Tamiami Trail bridges. These others show pumps and gates that help us to steer water into Everglades National Park and keep it in the park so that it's not flooding adjacent communities. So these are all collectively water infrastructure projects we need for Everglades restoration. But it's not just about infrastructure. It's also about the operational rules by which we manage this infrastructure. A great example of this is the new Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual that the Army Corps of Engineers has been leading development of for the last 2+ years. At the end of this year, 2022, this new plan will take effect. For the first time, we're going to see an operational plan of Lake Okeechobee that is aligned with the goals and objectives of Everglades restoration. Here, the new infrastructure is the hardening that's taken place over the last several years of the Herbert Hoover Dike. This dike that surrounds Lake Okeechobee with a reinforced dike, we can manage the lake in a way that's more beneficial and certainly more in balance with the needs of our coastal estuaries and with the Everglades to the south, while also meeting water supply needs around Lake Okeechobee. We've been engaged in this process from the very beginning. We've kept the county governments, particularly Miami-Dade, Broward counties, from a population standpoint, certainly the largest beneficiaries of the way that Lake Okeechobee is managed, and certainly Everglades restoration. Keeping them in the loop, both Mayors Geller and Levine Cava submitted letters to the colonel in Jacksonville, Army Corps of Engineers District, to speak their opinions and needs for balance, delivering more water to the south, particularly during the dry season when we run the risk of water shortages. And so this highlights the contribution that Mayor Levine Cava submitted to Colonel Kelly. We had meetings with scientists from South Florida engaging the colonel and his staff on the importance of sending flows south, and other leadership within the Army Corps of Engineers about the importance of this operational plan. And this, again, is to really speak to the importance of having that infrastructure and operating it to its optimal benefit for the environment in South Florida. The Everglades Foundation science team's been heavily engaged in this. Well, many of you know that we live right next door to this ecosystem. And whether you're in Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, you know that it's either agriculture or development that is immediately adjacent to this ecosystem. And development in particular poses challenges. The more we expand our urban development boundary towards the boundary with Everglades National Park or the water conservation areas, the more challenging and quite frankly costly it is to restore this ecosystem, to keep water in the Everglades and not have it pop up adjacent to it in somebody's backyard. This plan was developed with these concepts in mind, but it certainly is more challenging when the urban development boundary changes as we're planning these projects. In fact, some of these projects have components that are in areas that are currently under threat to development. We know that restoration works, and we have examples of this. The Kissimmee River Restoration Project. You may not be familiar with this. We took a 100-mile meandering stretch of the Kissimmee River and straightened it into a 50-mile canal. This was back in the 1960s. We realized by the 70s and 80s that this was a problem. The The restoration plan for the Kissimmee River was completed in the 1990s. And just last year, we finished restoring that ecosystem, filling in the canal, restoring the meandering Kissimmee River back to its once state. And we're now seeing the benefits of that, both in storage, habitat improvements, water quality, fisheries, et cetera. Likewise, the Picayune Strand project. This is a comprehensive Everglades restoration plan project in eastern Collier County, a 55,000 acre habitat restoration on a failed housing development. They drained a forested wetland, dug canals, built over 100 miles of roads, and now we're starting to see the benefits of that habitat restoration, which is in critical habitat area for the Florida panther, black bears, bald eagles. This is really an incredible success example of Everglades restoration. As Begonia mentioned earlier, this is our water supply. If you live in Miami-Dade County, Broward County, even Southern Palm Beach County or the Florida Keys, you get your water from underneath this ecosystem. When the Everglades are wet, we enjoy the benefits of that from our water supply. We're all connected to this ecosystem through our tap. But we also know that it's an important ecosystem economically and also in the fight against climate change. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's vulnerable to water quality impacts. I talked about the blue-green algae and red tide in lakes and estuaries, but in this ecosystem, an ecosystem that's adapted to incredibly low levels of phosphorus, really the quality of water that you find in rainfall. And when we change that, this ecosystem transforms in a very rapid and dramatic way. We see a conversion of these habitats that the Everglades is known for, ridges of sawgrass, open water sloughs with periphyton, and floating aquatic plants like white water lilies, supporting a diverse variety of large and small animals. When we pollute these areas with phosphorus, we see the disappearance of that periphyton mat, which is a fundamental component of the Everglades food web, and a conversion to cattail vegetation over time, which is essentially unusable for foraging habitat for wading birds. This map just shows over even 2 decades ago what the transformation of these native habitats into cattail with the yellows, oranges, and reds look like. And we know there's been expansion of these areas since then. The way we deal with this, I mentioned the treatment wetlands earlier, the stormwater treatment areas that the state of Florida has conducted or constructed south of some of these projects and along the southern rim of the Everglades agricultural area, these STAs and FEB, which is a flow equalization. These are wetlands that were engineered and are managed to clean up the water that flows off these agricultural lands that we know is polluted or coming out of Lake Okeechobee. The idea is that as the water passes through, the vegetation and soil sequester those nutrients so that by the time the water gets to the horizon in this photo, it's moving into the Everglades substantially cleaner than it was going in. This is how we ensure clean water is going south. And we're not seeing enough of that clean water going south. This is why we need restoration. And the peat soils, the very foundation of this ecosystem, is perhaps the most important indicator. Too often we see these organic soils that have accumulated over centuries to millennia being dried, over dried to the point where these soils break down and we lose elevation very rapidly. Sometimes these soils can catch fire because we simply don't have enough water out in the Everglades. So not only are we losing habitat and elevation, these soils also contain massive quantities of carbon that are being emitted out to the atmosphere. So when you see these dried organic soils, you know that they're a carbon source to our atmosphere on a massive scale. So with restoration and returning those natural historic volumes of clean fresh water to the south, we protect these different habitats, those open water sloughs, with the floating aquatic and submerged aquatic vegetation, the sawgrass ridges that are in the higher elevation areas, and the highest ground out in the Everglades, these tree islands that you see at the back of this image. And as we restore these habitats and protect the existing habitats that are out there, we can return the Everglades back to this patterned landscape. And we see this patterned landscape preserved in some areas where there's sufficient water, but most areas, this patterned landscape has been lost. This is from Google Earth. If you take it to about 40,000 feet in altitude, this is what you see. So if you're flying over the Everglades in a commercial aircraft, you would see this patterned landscape with these teardrop-shaped tree islands, all oriented in the direction of flow. These beige-colored sawgrass ridges, again, aligned with those flow paths of that historic sheet flow, and the darker open water sloughs in between. This is not just an attractive aspect of the ecosystem. Functionally, it's perhaps the most important aspect of the Everglades. Because if we take these habitats and we get the water right with the natural rise and fall going from the wet season to the dry season, we see this really beautiful functional attribute of the historic Everglades play out. During the wet season, when water levels are at their highest, we see the small fish and crayfish and organisms that would otherwise be eaten in these open water sloughs are seeking refuge and hiding in these sawgrass ridges. As the dry season progresses, all that water and all those organisms are forced out into these sloughs where they concentrate into dense areas for wading birds and alligators to take advantage of. And it's this concentration of food each year that the Everglades was known for and allowed for those historic populations, legendary populations of wading birds across this ecosystem. And so by getting the water right and restoring these habitats, we can also ensure healthy populations of those predators that the Everglades was known for historically. And just from the wading bird perspective, we know that we have a diverse variety of these birds that inhabit these sloughs and forage out in the Everglades. This is just a subset of some of those species that you might be familiar with. And as we get water flowing once again through this freshwater ecosystem, that water passes through the mangrove ecotone that wraps around the tip of the peninsula. And as that water feeds out from those mangrove creeks into places like Florida Bay, that might be the finish line, but the benefits don't end there. This just shows the tea-stained tannin waters that are passing through that very thick mangrove forest around the coast. And this is just a qualitative indicator of what that freshwater flow looks like at this end of the ecosystem. And it benefits the seagrasses, the mangroves, and of course, all the species that depend on that, whether marine mammals like manatees, sea turtles, recreational fisheries, the wading birds that we talked about, as well as the hundreds of thousands of migratory wintering birds that come here each year. And of course, our economy depends on this. I touched on the importance of our tourism-based economy earlier, and it goes without saying that if we pollute our waterways, and this is a quote from our state's economist, if we contaminate our waterways to the point where we have toxic blue-green algae, our economy is going to be sensitive to that. It's going to affect tourism. It's going to affect hotel stays and restaurant visits. And so there's been substantial study on this. Tourism is a substantial component of our economy. These are data from 2017, and it's nearly $86 billion, supporting 1.5 million jobs. Real estate, likewise, depends on clean water. We've looked at the models, and there's a very clear relationship between the quality of the water and real estate values. We also know boating and fishing are important sectors of our state's economy as well. We commissioned an economic study in 2010. You may have heard of it, the Mather study. This was an independent economic study that showed for every dollar invested in Everglades restoration, we get $4 in return in these key sectors of our state's economy. We recommissioned this study in 2020. Again, the results are the same, 4-to-1 return on the investment. And it's even more important with what we know about climate change. And really, we need to think about Everglades restoration as a resilience builder for South Florida. These large storage reservoirs help us to capture water when it's in abundance and use that water to the benefit of our water supply and the Everglades when it's not in abundance. And so going into an uncertain climate future, it's been recognized by the National Academy of Sciences, the resilience offices across South Florida, that Everglades restoration is to our benefit. These are some excerpts from biennial reports that the National Academy of Sciences in their reports to Congress on the progress of Everglades restoration have echoed about climate change and sea level rise. And the takeaway is that we don't need to change the plan, we just need to implement it faster, knowing what we know about sea level rise, climate change, and the impacts that it's going to have around our coast. Well, I'd like to end on this slide and just echo the point that Begonia made earlier, that we hope that you'll follow us on social media, check us out on the web, and certainly reach out if you have any questions. We're here to help, and our mission is about restoring and protecting this ecosystem that we all benefit from. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. And we got a lot of questions in the chat box. So I am happy we have some time left so we can address some of those. So the first question I see is one question that I saw on social media a lot as we were promoting this Everglades Restoration 101, and it kind of ties into a question that someone put on the chat box. And it's, why is this taking so long? You know, people in the social media, they say, I hear about Everglades restoration year after year, and I hear different governors talking about it. Why does it take so long? And someone in the chat box was asking about funding for this effort. And does it depend more on federal or state funding? And that's kind of linked to the timing of this as well.
Well, that's... I'll give you the short version of that answer because the long version could take a few hours, but it's really two things. Fundamentally, it's two things. It's political will, and that also relates directly to the funding needed to build these projects. When the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was passed in 2000, the estimate was it would cost $8 billion, and that would largely be paid out over a 20-year period of time with commitments from the state and federal government of roughly $200 million per year. It's a 50-50 partnership between the state of Florida and the Army Corps of Engineers and federal government. So if we had lived up to that commitment, we'd be further along, much farther. But because of the delays and largely underfunding, we're to a point now where the costs are rising faster than we're getting projects built. So that gets back to my point of political will, and we're finally starting to see the momentum there. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a substantial uptick in federal funding, and certainly the recent $1.1 billion commitment is helping us to get some of these projects ticked off that have been authorized for almost 13, 14 years. The key, though, is, as I mentioned, getting that Everglades reservoir funded and built. It's been authorized. The state of Florida is building their treatment marsh component of that, but we've got a pretty substantial lift needed by the federal government, and it's to the tune of about $3.5 billion for that project. Again, we know these are expensive. but we also know that they're really critical to Florida's future. And we know that they're wise investments with a minimum 4-to-1 return. So there's the political will and the funding side of things, but let's face it, we also have forces that are working against us, forces that benefit from the status quo that have worked to stall and delay these projects, particularly the reservoir that we know we need to build. So again, we could take more time on that, but I hope that that answers your question.
Thank you. So yes, both state and federal, and it's also a massive project. So the nature of it's going to take long. Someone's asking about the seagrass die-offs in Florida Bay. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how it all connects back all the way down to the Florida Keys.
Sure. And in Florida Bay, it's not sort of a typical estuary like, say, the Chesapeake Bay, where you have these rivers that just sort of give way to the ocean, where they just open up and feed fresh water to the coast. Florida Bay is unique in that it's shallow, and it's almost like an ice cube tray with a series of small basins that are all disconnected from one another by mud banks and seagrasses and mangrove islands. It also gets fresh water from the Everglades directly through a smaller flow path called Taylor Slough, which, if you've driven through the main park road, you've crossed the headwaters of Taylor Slough, and it's not massive by any means. It also gets fresh water from around Cape Sable and the southwestern tip of the peninsula from the massive quantities of fresh water that empty out through Shark River Slough. And it's these two sources that really combine in the center of the bay to prevent hypersaline conditions from developing. And hypersalinity is when we get this ice cube tray with no fresh water coming in. Some of those little basins evaporate so much water that the salt accumulates, and they can have salinity levels that exceed the ocean level of salinity. In some cases, we see salinities in Florida Bay more than twice the salinity of the ocean. That stresses the seagrasses. Combined with high summertime temperatures, we get a depletion of oxygen. The grass then subsequently dies, and it really happens all at once and spreads like wildfire. So these aren't grasses growing in marine salinities. These are grasses that are exposed to unnatural excesses in salinity that are simply due to a lack of fresh water. We had a seagrass die-off in 2015 that was roughly a direct impact of about 40,000 acres. This is a massive area of Florida Bay that just died all at once. And it's taken, here we are, 7 years or more later, and we're still seeing the bay recover from that. And once the grass dies, you lose the ability of the bay bottom sediments to be locked into place. You get more resuspension, more nutrients coming up from the bottom. That leads to algal blooms. It's just a downward spiral of impacts in Florida Bay when we have a seagrass die-off. So the bay is not out of that 2015 die-off yet, and our goal is to move restoration along fast enough to where we don't see something like that happen again.
Great. There's a couple of questions about the problems in the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie. And the question is, what's the difference between what's coming from septic tanks that have been implicated? And there's also questions about what's being done north of the lake to kind of help filter that water and how that relates to actual restoration projects.
Okay, that's a lot. We have a really good understanding of the sources of pollution going into these estuaries. And certainly we know that septic is a contributor to that. Septic is just a horrible idea for our transmissive, our porous soils down here in South Florida. It's to the point where whatever comes out of your septic tank is almost mainlined into our waterways, as opposed to up north where that technology originated, where you've got silty clay soils that retain a lot of that material, so that by the time that effluent makes it into the waterways, it's quite a bit cleaner. We don't get that kind of scrubbing from our soils, from our geology here in South Florida. So septic, we need to move off that as much as we can. Having said that, we know that when these lake discharges, so we have an understanding of the local basin contributions of pollutants in both of these watersheds. When the lake is discharging, those watershed boundaries are effectively extended all the way up to Orlando. It's an unnatural volume, and the quality of that water we can implicate all the way up to the watershed of Lake Okeechobee. And when the discharges are occurring, they're far and away the greatest source of phosphorus and nitrogen pollution going into both of those estuaries. So we've got to deal with both problems, though. We got to deal with septic, but fundamentally, our biggest impact is in redirecting that water that's being dumped to tide to the south, where we know we can store it, clean it, and ensure that quality water is being sent south. And that helps to cut away at that pollution going to both coasts.
Someone in the chat says, wouldn't it be easier to transfer the agriculture industry, the sugar industry, somewhere else?
Well, that's more of an economic and a political question. But when the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan was passed, there was sort of input by all these stakeholder groups. And within that plan, everyone recognized the significance of the Everglades Reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee and the need for upwards of 60,000 acres for storing that water so that we can send it south, clean it, send it south.
Someone's asking a little bit about the Army Corps of Engineers and how do they listen to organizations like ours, and how do they work with us as well as other groups?
We've seen over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, just an increased level of engagement from the Army Corps of Engineers. We have a good dialogue with them, and it's because of our reputation as a science-based organization. We can speak directly with their lead modelers and engineers to talk about the technical aspects of some of these projects, and they appreciate what we bring to them from that scientific perspective. So we've seen an increased dialogue and a willingness to engage stakeholders like us in helping to improve these projects, as well as the operations of these projects, like in the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual.
There's a question about how does the restoration plan take into account increased rainfall due to warming oceans and hurricanes, as well as sea level rise? And the question says, where will all the water go with sea level rise? So maybe a little bit about how it impacts.
Sure. Well, I can speak to this from the perspective of the Everglades ecosystem. Obviously, there are challenges on the built environment side of South Florida, and many of you are probably familiar with our gravity flow flood control system and some of the retrofitting that's taken place with more pumps and allowing us the capacity to move water off our landscapes. But in the Everglades, particularly in Everglades National Park, we know that it's too dry for much of the year. And we've had upwards of 8 to 10 inches of sea level rise over the last century. With a reduced freshwater flow, that's allowed that saltwater intrusion to penetrate further into this very low-lying, low-sloping landscape. So increasing the flow of freshwater isn't going to stop sea level rise. We know that, but it will slow the radical, in some cases, devastating transformation of habitats that have been taking place simply because we're not getting enough fresh water into the ecosystem, let alone the benefits to our water supply and slowing saltwater intrusion into the aquifer. So we do know that there are benefits to be gained there. With respect to climate change, changes in rainfall patterns, we're staying up to date with downscaling the latest climate change model output and applying that to our regional hydrologic models so that we can understand what climate change will do to our Everglades and our water availability in South Florida over the next 70 to 80 years. And we're actually working to download the latest and downscale the latest climate model output to help us make those forecasts. It's only through those pathways that we can understand then, by running that same model, what Everglades restoration can do to offset that. And again, it's largely to my earlier point that having more storage allows us places to put that water and hold it until we really need it. And in a more uncertain climate future, that's going to be incredibly beneficial for us.
Great. Someone's asking about, are animals in the Everglades endangered because of water shortage?
Some of them are, absolutely. Some species are imperiled because we're not providing the Everglades with enough water, or we've changed the quantity of water in a given location to where it's not timed with the natural rise and fall. It goes without saying that the plants and animals that were out there before we came and started draining this ecosystem, their biological clocks were all attuned to the natural seasonality and quality of water the Everglades was known for. And so we interrupted that, and the consequences of that are being realized in the reduced population numbers for a number of species. At the same time, we've seen an introduction of a number of non-native plants and animals that don't have natural competitors that are flourishing under the mild South Florida wet climate that we have down here. So it's almost these forces working in opposition to one another in terms of how species are responding. But in general, we know that getting the water right, restoring this ecosystem will benefit a number of these imperiled species and will actually make the situation a little more challenging for some of these invasive introduced species that are currently flourishing in this dried and degraded state.
Is it fair to say we are restoring things back to nature? Is this natural infrastructure what we're doing?
Yeah, well, that's important to recognize, because the Everglades will always be a managed system, even in its restored state. We rely on this infrastructure, and it's not ideal that some of the infrastructure that we're depending on now requires fossil fuels in order to be operated, but we are in a flat, low-lying state here in Florida, and particularly South Florida, and with a very porous geology, and we need those pumps and that infrastructure to keep conditions optimal for us as well as for the environment. And ideally, we'll have technologies advanced to where we can shift over some of that infrastructure perhaps to more natural, more green type infrastructure, or structures that will be solar powered or through other means that don't emit fossil fuel or greenhouse gases. So it's going to be a managed system, at least into the foreseeable future.
Okay, great. There's a couple more questions about carbon sequestration and carbon storage and mangroves role in this. So maybe touch a little bit more on that and the peat soil.
Sure. So these soils, whether in the freshwater Everglades or through that mangrove zone that wraps around the peninsula, this is an accumulation of dead plant parts over time. So mangroves, as an example, are producing roots constantly, and those roots are turning over, meaning some are dying back, new roots are growing. But that stuff accumulates over time because those soils are saturated or flooded most of the time. And it's those wetland conditions that allow these types of systems to sequester carbon and keep it locked into those soils. The freshwater Everglades I mentioned earlier, those wetlands do the same thing, not as fast or as well as the mangroves, but certainly over a much larger scale. Those plants grow. We have a year-round growing season, so they're growing, they're dying back, they're accumulating in those flooded or saturated soil conditions, and it builds up. But we know that if you dry those soils out, just like your compost pile, it'll break down pretty quickly. And we know that that releases carbon to the atmosphere. It takes a long time to resequester that carbon in those soils. So it's best to protect what we have and at the same time try to restore that sequestration functionality. We're also learning more about what mangroves have the capacity to do with sea level rise and how they may benefit from freshwater flow restoration as well.
All right, there's one question that sounds very scientific. I'm gonna say it to you. Do concrete quarries have any possible role in phytoremediation, especially down here in Miami?
Well, those of you from South Florida, if you drive along the turnpike or you fly into Miami International Airport, you've seen them, these massive rectangular lime rock quarries. Some of them have brilliant blue-green colors. These are basically holes in the ground where they mined the limestone out, and now it's a lake. The problem is that lake is connected to our aquifer. Water moves freely through that rock. So in comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, storage areas in that area called the lake belt were conceived. The problem is at the time, they didn't have a solution for how to seal off those pits so that you can fluctuate water levels as needed for storage and for benefit to the Everglades without pulling water from the adjacent aquifer, which in some areas is immediately next to Miami-Dade's Northwest Wellfield. Nearly a third to a half of our county's water supply comes from the Northwest Wellfield. So technologies are advancing. We're learning that we can cost effectively build seepage barriers or walls underground and potentially seal off some of these pits. So 5-10 years from now, that might be a reality where we can utilize some of those rock pits to the benefit of restoration and using that storage as it was conceived in the comprehensive restoration plan.
Okay, great. Steve, the last question is regarding the urban development boundary and its importance to Everglades restoration and to protect our water supply.
Oh, it's, you know, if you know Miami-Dade County, we've got a buffer between the developed areas and where Everglades National Park and the water conservation areas are. Along that buffer, we have a number of components, projects that were conceived in the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. Many of those have not been planned or authorized, let alone, you know, have been built to this point. So protecting that urban development boundary means that we can realize the benefits of restoration that those key components will provide. And some of them are out near Chrome Avenue. And certainly threats to that area will change our options for how we can restore the Everglades and perhaps undermine the investments that have already been made. Billions of dollars invested already. We could undermine the benefits of that by continually expanding that urban development boundary closer to this ecosystem.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. There were a lot of questions in the chat regarding what can I do to help? How do I volunteer? And we get that question asked a lot. And I would say that this is the first thing you can do is, come to this webinar, understand the issue, read up about it, tell other people about it. Tell people in Miami that their water is supplied by the Everglades. Tell your elected official about it so that they know that this issue is important to you. So come and visit our website. You can sign up for our newsletter at the bottom. I'm going to leave our email on the chat box. I know there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but feel free to reach out to us. And make sure to follow us on social media so you can hear about more events. I got some questions about the 75th anniversary. So lots of events coming up. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you all, and really appreciate you all joining us this evening. Thanks.